Welcome to the channel. Today, we're exploring some unbelievable story. Stay tuned and let's dive in. 2 years ago, after finishing my master's degree in computer science with a concentration on network security, I relocated to Los Angeles to begin my career. Getting a job at Oracle straight out of school sounded like the ideal chance, yet, the most difficult task was finding a place to live. I figured I could afford an apartment in the city, but I soon discovered that renting alone was almost impossible unless I wanted numerous roommates. Following some recommendations from coworkers, I narrowed my search to Long Beach, where everything began to come together. One evening, my friend and I went to a new restaurant on Maple Street that had received fantastic ratings. We passed a club as the door opened, showing a performer dressed as Madonna on stage. She stared at me, puzzled. Why would they want to do that? My thoughts turned to Ethan and Lisa from 28 months ago in Long Beach. I hate the bar scene, I replied, exasperated after another fruitless effort to meet someone. Ethan just laughed, but I was serious. Earlier that night, in a downtown pub, a drunk female poured 2 beers all on me. She whispered an apology and the bartender handed me a towel, but the harm had been done. I went home, ashamed to be riding the metro drenched in alcohol. People stared, assuming I was destitute. When I reached my destination, I dashed back to my flat. Ethan grinned as he opened the door. Looks like you had a party. I wasn't amused, but I knew better than to mock my 63 drag queen roommate. I had moved to Los Angeles 22 months ago after getting my master's in computer science. Oracle had offered me a dream job with great pay and a relocation from Seattle. But finding an apartment in the city was harder than I expected unless I wanted to live with 5 roommates in a tiny space. After some advice from coworkers, I started looking in Long Beach. That's how I ended up walking down a charming Long Beach street looking for an apartment. I found the address next to a small restaurant and climbed the stairs to meet the tenants, Ethan and Lisa. Lisa, a slim woman in a leotard, opened the door. After a brief introduction, she led me inside to meet Ethan, a towering man who, despite his intimidating height, was polite and showed me around the surprisingly nice apartment. They offered me the biggest room, but at 60% of the rent. Still, it was affordable, so I considered it. But before I could say yes, they started asking about my job and lifestyle, like I was applying for a club membership. Then Ethan asked, "Are you gay?" "I'm not gay," I said, "but I hope you won't hold that against me." Ethan laughed. "I guess you can be our token straight tenant." After that, we relaxed and I moved in. Lisa was a dancer by passion, though she worked as a waitress to pay the bills. Ethan, on the other hand, performed as a female impersonator on weekends and worked at Starbucks during the day. Despite the initial awkwardness, we made a good household. I quickly realized that, despite the intense question, working at Oracle was another challenge. Surrounded by brilliant minds, I initially felt out of place. It took time to adjust and contribute, but after 7 months, I started to find my footing. The job required frequent trips to Seattle, which became exhausting over time, especially when I had to be back in the office the next morning after long flights. As a result, my personal life took a hit, or would have if I'd had much of one. I hadn't dated much since losing my parents in a tragic accident just before my college graduation. The grief consumed me for a while, delaying my plans for graduate school and forcing me to handle their affairs. By the time I enrolled at Stanford 2 years later, I had left Seattle behind, both physically and emotionally. At Stanford, I focused on my studies, barely socializing, with a skewed male-to-female ratio. Dating opportunities were slim. By the time I graduated and moved to Los Angeles, I hoped to meet new people, but the dating scene wasn't what I expected. Many women I met were older and looking for a serious commitment, while others closer to my age seemed more interested in partying and alcohol. The final straw came when a drunken woman at a downtown bar spilled beer all over me. Frustrated, I vented to Ethan, who listened patiently. "You're going about this all wrong," he said. "Meeting women in bars won't work if the only thing you have in common is alcohol." He suggested I try a dating website called iContact. I was skeptical, but Ethan convinced me to give it a shot. The site was expensive, which Ethan explained was intentional, to weed out casual daters. Hesitant but curious, I signed up and filled out a lengthy questionnaire about myself. Rather than focusing on what I wanted in a partner, I just told the truth. As I finished, Lisa peeked over my shoulder, offering her usual sarcastic commentary. But despite her opinions, I was ready to see where this new approach might lead. The next step was uploading a photo. I didn't have any, but Lisa quickly grabbed her digital camera, adjusted the lighting, and snapped a few shots. When I asked how I looked, she quipped, "Almost human." Still, she uploaded one to my profile, and it looked pretty decent. After saving my profile, I asked Ethan, "Now what?" He smiled. "Just wait, this gets good." Ethan and Lisa whispered and laughed behind me as I rated 3 women's profiles based on appearance, interest, and overall appeal. I asked, "How do I contact them?" Ethan smiled, "You don't. They are just models." Before I could get frustrated, a message appeared. Within 24 hours, iContact would provide real matches based on my preferences, complete with contact information. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it, but I had to wait until after work to log in. When I got home, both Ethan and Lisa hovered over my shoulder as I checked the site. 3 profiles popped up. The first was a cute redhead working as a copywriter. She seemed fun. The second, a tall brunette from an art gallery, made me think of museum dates and cozy dinners. Both were appealing, but the third, she was stunning, with dark hair, striking eyes, and high cheekbones. An investment banker, a little older than me, but our interests matched perfectly. Lisa, looking over my shoulder, remarked that she would date the woman herself. As I was about to click on the contact info, Ethan stopped me and asked if I was sure she was the right choice, suggesting she might be out of my league. Annoyed, I reminded him that he had convinced me to try the service, and I insisted that if iContact thought we were a match, I was going for it. Ethan backed off, raising his hands and advising me not to get burned. I clicked on the contact info and saw her name, Samantha Hayes, along with her phone number and email. I was about to email her when Lisa stopped me, asking if I really planned to do that. I admitted I thought it was a low-pressure way to introduce myself, but Lisa scoffed, saying an email wouldn't impress her. Instead, she suggested I call. Lisa advised me to ask if Rachel would be in town the following Monday rather than a weekend, because she might already have plans. She also suggested meeting for a drink near Rachel's office, as it would make her feel more comfortable and give her an easy way out if things didn't go well. The logic made sense, so I agreed. I grabbed my phone, saved Rachel's contact information, and made the call. To my surprise, she answered. Following Lisa's advice, I asked if she'd like to. The entire weekend I kept thinking about the meeting, debating what to wear and rehearsing conversations. I felt like a nervous teenager on his first date. Ethan, sensing my nerves, told me to relax and be myself, advice I knew I needed to follow. Monday arrived, and after work, I arrived at the restaurant right on time. She wasn't there yet, and as I ordered a drink, I started preparing myself for a possible no-show. But just as my drink arrived, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Rachel, looking even more stunning in person. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and before I knew it, it was 8:30. I suggested dinner, and she eagerly agreed. We continued chatting over a light meal, and I found her to be everything I had hoped for: engaging, funny, and genuinely interesting. Thankfully, she seemed to enjoy my company too, and the evening turned out better than I had imagined. I checked my phone and realized it was past 11. Apologizing for keeping Rachel out so late, I offered to get her a cab. As I opened the door for her, she paused and told me, "You're different from most men I meet." Curious, I asked, "Good different or bad different?" She smiled and replied, "That's different. Most men would have tried something by now." I decided to ask if she'd like to go out again. She said, "Definitely," kissed me on the cheek before getting into the cab, and I made my way home, floating on air, thrilled with how the evening had gone. Showing restraint, I waited until Monday to call her. When she answered, I asked if she was still interested in meeting up, and she agreed but sounded a little less enthusiastic than before. I asked what day worked best for her, and she suggested Saturday. Then, without thinking, on Thursday, I contacted Rachel to confirm the date, keeping the location a mystery. The following evening, I met her outside her workplace, and we took a taxi to Hollywood Boulevard, where we sat on the mezzanine overlooking the crowded street. After a few minutes, Rachel said, "What are we doing?" I smiled and said, "People watching." Just then, I pointed out a tall man in a fedora and trench coat below us. As he stopped, he sat down, opened a backpack, and music began to play. To Rachel's surprise, the man threw off his coat, revealing a silver dress and heels. Ethan, in full drag, as Lady Gaga's Born This Way blared, started dancing, joined by a group of performers who shed their coats to reveal matching outfits. The entire station stopped to watch, laughing and clapping. I glanced at Rachel, and to my relief, she was laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes, clapping along with the performance. It was clear the surprise had worked perfectly. As the song ended, the dancers blended back into the crowd, leaving Ethan alone. He climbed the stairs toward us, singing the final lines of Born This Way. When he reached us, he popped into my lap and gave me a big kiss on the cheek. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Ethan stood, bowed, and then I introduced him to Rachel. She told him the performance was amazing and admitted she'd never seen a flash mob in person. We went to a club for food and drinks, and Rachel had a great time. She enjoyed the performances and thought Ethan and his friends were wonderful. When we left, she pulled me into a cab, and after complimenting me on the surprise, kissed me passionately. We arrived at her place, and she hurried me inside. We spent the night together, full of passion, and I woke up the next morning to a repeat of the excitement. We showered together, and I finally had a chance. Over time, I began to spend more time at Rachel's apartment, where her roommates were, and she loved it when I found new ways to surprise her. We went to Griffith Park to see the botanical gardens, took a ferry ride to Catalina Island, and attended a modern dance performance with Lisa's help. We rented a car and drove to Napa Valley to spend the weekend with Rachel's parents. As we arrived at their large estate, my nerves increased, knowing they were quite wealthy. After Rachel called out to them, her parents warmly greeted her, and I shook hands with Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell. Mrs. Mitchell, or Margaret, was elegant, though slightly altered by cosmetic surgery, and William Hayes was stocky with white hair and a firm handshake. The next morning, I hurried to join everyone for breakfast in the conservatory. Mr. Mitchell mentioned plans for the day, a poolside lunch, a drive around town, and dinner at a country club. I had hoped for more time alone with Rachel, but the weekend seemed to be busy with her parents. After breakfast, we toured the house and grounds, and the sheer size of the estate left me in awe. Later, we changed for the pool, while Rachel and Margaret lounged in the sun. Richard drove us around the area, pointing out changes since Rachel had moved to Los Angeles. I marveled at the massive estates along the coast, a clear sign of the wealth in the area. By the time we returned to Rachel's parents' house, it was nearly time for dinner. Although the dress code was casual, I suspected their version was different from mine, so I put on slacks, a knit shirt, and a sports coat. I felt fine until I saw Margaret and Rachel in Cock. After dinner, Richard invited me to the library for a brandy and inquired about my background. He assumed my father worked in music law, but I proudly co. The following day, I was relieved when Rachel and I finally left for Los Angeles. On the way back, she teased me about looking like I'd been to the dentist. I told her that the weekend felt like a constant interrogation and asked if her parents were always like that. She laughed and reassured me, explaining that they were just protective because she was their only child. She shared stories of her rebellious youth, recounting how she had always done what she wanted despite their plans. When I expressed concern about the impression I made on her parents, Rachel dismissed it, saying they didn't think anyone was good enough for her. She even joked that her father suggested a prenuptial agreement, which threw me off, making me wonder if Rachel was hinting at marriage, though we hadn't discussed it yet. We held hands the rest of the way back to the city, my mind racing with thoughts about our future. Once we arrived in Los Angeles, our busy travel schedules kept us while Rachel was away on a business trip. I decided to propose. I wasn't inexperienced in the bedroom, but I quickly realized Rachel was on a whole other level. She knew how to take things to the next level and taught me to do the same. I was curious about her past, but I knew I couldn't expect her to be pure, especially in Los Angeles. Whatever her experiences were, I was benefiting from them now. When Rachel returned from Chicago late Tuesday, she was exhausted, so we made plans for Thursday night. I kept the surprise quiet, and after dinner and dancing, I took her to the Golden Gate Bridge. We rode to the top of the bridge, where I led her to the edge, and just as she turned to ask why we were there, I dropped to one knee and presented the ring. "Samantha Hayes, will you marry me?" I asked, and she quickly said yes to the cheers of nearby tourists. Despite my concerns about her parents, Rachel was adamant about getting married right away at City Hall. The next day, we arrived at the Los Angeles Marriage Bureau, but after completing the paperwork, we learned about the mandatory 24-hour waiting period. Rachel was undeterred, and she planned to return the next day with Sophia and Olivia as her bridesmaids. I was happy to. On Saturday afternoon, I waited in my best suit as Rachel arrived in a stunning black dress with a large hat, flanked by her bridesmaids in matching off-white dresses. The ceremony was short and sweet, and after we kissed as husband and wife, Lisa popped open a bottle of champagne to celebrate. We moved into the hallway to make way for the next couple, sharing champagne straight from the bottle. Ethan handed me the keys to the car he'd rented for us, and as we left, "Rachel, I guess that's one tradition that won't come true," I joked as we drove off, beginning our new life together. As we headed toward the Bay Bridge, Rachel asked, "Where are we going?" I smiled and told her to be patient, saying it was another surprise. I'd already had her packed for a short honeymoon, but hadn't revealed the destination. We drove north on I-5, then west on I-10, and it wasn't until we reached Santa Barbara that she figured it out. Laughing, she said, she adored the concept and couldn't wait to tell her buddies. We stayed at the Seaside Inn, a charming boutique hotel with ocean views, and when we entered our honeymoon suite, complete with a heart-shaped bed and an in-room jacuzzi, Rachel burst out laughing, especially when the bed rotated and vibrated. Despite the fact that it was a short weekend, we had a great time. We went to Santa Monica Beach and even got drenched in the Pacific Ocean. The area around Santa Monica was. I pulled Rachel close and said, "Good night, Mrs. Mitchell." She replied, "Thank you, darling." It was a wonderful surprise, before falling asleep. The next morning, Sophia and Olivia had already left for work, and I'd taken an extra day off to move my things into the apartment. As I brought in my belongings, I asked Rachel when her roommates planned to move out, and she seemed surprised, saying she hadn't thought about it and didn't want to ask them to leave because they'd lived together since college. I wasn't thrilled with her response, but I decided to let it go. I overheard Rachel on the phone with her parents, telling them about our quick wedding, and though they weren't happy, she assured me that they'd get over it as they always did. Living with two other women wasn't as glamorous as it may appear, and they treated me like I was part of the furniture, casually going about their lives, sometimes even walking around in their underwear, but there was no intention behind it. As time passed, Rachel and I settled into our married life, which was not much different from before, aside from the official status. My job had improved, and I was now a team leader. Though my West Coast travel kept me busy, I stayed in touch with Ethan and Lisa, even helping a coworker move into my old apartment so they wouldn't be financially impacted by my departure. If there was any stress in our lives, it was my constant effort to keep surprising Rachel as she thrived. As we approached our one-year anniversary, I wanted to do something special but struggled to come up with an idea. After a long red-eye flight delayed by storms, I arrived home exhausted and decided to take the day off. The apartment was empty, so I collapsed on the bed, my mind still racing for a surprise idea. Then, I noticed Rachel had left her laptop on, which was unusual for her. I moved the mouse and saw a Google News window. As I checked her recycle bin and downloads, but everything had been cleared. I knew Google's Chrome browser well enough to realize that hitting clear all doesn't truly delete downloads, so I opened the Windows Downloads folder and was shocked to find it filled with eye contact profiles. Rachel had downloaded dozens of them, about one every 3 weeks, and as I reviewed the files, I found one with my own profile picture taken nearly a year ago by Lisa. To my horror, the mower tried to remain calm, hoping there was an innocent explanation, but my instincts told me something was wrong. After copying all the profiles onto a flash drive and returning Rachel's computer to its original state, I researched detective agencies. I found one called Pinehill Investigations and arranged a meeting. When I met with Miss Martin, a professional detective, she copied the files and Rachel's profile from my flash drive and agreed to invest. After that, I called Rachel and left a message, pretending to be stuck in Mountain View for a few more days. Then I called Ethan and Lisa and went over to talk things through with them. While Ethan hoped for the best, Lisa was skeptical, and I feared she was right. I stayed at their place overnight, and the next day, I went to work as usual. Miss Martin called to let me know the report was ready, and I arrived at her office at 3, filled with conflict. Miss Martin stated that he left the hotel around 7:30 a.m. the next morning, and Mrs. Mitchell checked. I asked, "So there's no actual proof of what happened in the room?" Miss Martin calmly responded, explaining that they had planted a motion-sensitive camera in Rachel's room. She handed me a CD but advised against watching it, warning that while I already knew the truth, the video would only create painful, unforgettable images. I hesitated but agreed to think about it. Miss Martin asked if I was considering reconciliation. I said, no way, explaining that not only had Miss Martin, unfazed, asked if I had legal representation. I admitted that I didn't, and she offered to refer me to an attorney in the same building. I didn't care if the agency got a commission, I just wanted to move forward. She arranged for me to meet with the lawyer that day, and that evening, I returned to Long Beach with the folder and a business card for my new attorney. Lisa was home, and I told her everything. When I mentioned the CD, she offered to preview it for me, and after watching it, she returned with tears in her eyes and gently advised me not to watch it, saying it would only make things worse. I took her advice, and with my decision made, I focused on the details of what I needed to do. Ethan and Lisa were fully supportive, already talking as if they were in charge of the situation, and their care and involvement touched me deeply. I returned to Rachel's apartment on Saturday afternoon, carrying my bags as if I had just arrived from the airport. When I walked in, I found the three roommates huddled on the couch, giggling and whispering. Rachel jumped up, ran over, and leaped into my arms, while Sophia and Olivia snickered. Rachel told me she had missed me a lot as she kissed me passionately. Then, with a sly look, she reminded me that the weekend was our anniversary and asked the rest of the evening went as usual, except for Rachel's frequent whispering to Sophia and Olivia, which I assumed was either guessing about the surprise or comparing me to the red-headed man. I chose to ignore it. At bedtime, Rachel initiated lovemaking, as she often did after one of our trips, but I refused, knowing what she'd been doing in Chicago. I pushed her away, saying, not tonight, nor tomorrow night. This is part of the surprise. You'll have to wait till Sunday. She seemed surprised and disappointed, since she was usually excited for my West Coast excursions, but the prospect of the surprise stopped her from pushing any more, and she ultimately went into a restless slumber. Saturday was just as frustrating for her. Sophia and Olivia took turns trying to get details from me whenever Rachel wasn't around, offering their help with the surprise. I assured them everything was under control, hoping it was, and then teased them by saying they'd be part of the surprise as well. This sent them into excited chatter, and they eagerly told Rachel, who couldn't sit still in anticipation. That evening, I gave no more clues and suggested we order takeout. Rachel's displeasure was evident. She attempted to persuade me again, but I stood strong. You don't want to ruin the surprise, I told her, and she reluctantly gave up, turning over to sleep. On Sunday morning, I knew I had to give them something to avoid rebellion. Over breakfast, I told them we'd leave the apartment at 12:30 sharp, no special clothing or bags required, and we'd all leave together in a single cab. Their curiosity was on overdrive, and I left them guessing while I stepped outside to call Ethan, who assured me everything was ready, just be on time and enjoy the show. At 12:30, I gathered the three of them and headed downstairs. The doorman found Olivia questioned, "Why are we at Lincoln Square? Is this where the surprise occurs?" I smiled as I led them to the base of the statue and had them sit on the steps. The area was buzzing with tourists and passers-by, enjoying the sunny day. Suddenly, a man approached and placed a boombox behind them, flicking it on. A rhythmic drumbeat startled the girls and drew the attention of the crowd. As the beat continued, a group of passers-by gathered in a circle around the monument, and on cue, began a choreographed dance reminiscent of the Rockets. As the performance progressed, one of the dancers moved forward, carrying a poster of a man's face and displaying it to the audience and the females. Is this the one that got away? The crowd seemed to wonder as more dancers appeared, each holding posters of different male faces. While Rachel laughed at the performance, Olivia suddenly frowned, recognizing one of the faces and pointing it out to Sophia, who leaned in closer. The posters were pictures of the men from Rachel's eye contact profile. As more faces appeared, Olivia began tugging on Rachel's arm, urging her to look more carefully. Rachel's mood shifted abruptly as she realized what was. As the song reached the bridge, the dancers continued their high-energy routine, holding the posters aloft for everyone to see. At that point, all the dancers dropped their posters to the ground. Then, from behind the statue, Ethan and Lisa appeared, holding a single poster with pictures of Rachel and me. They walked up to the three-seated girls, whose faces had turned pale despite the bright afternoon sun. Ethan and Lisa tugged on the sides of the poster, splitting it. As the song looped, the circle of dancers parted, and I walked forward. I went straight to Rachel, whose tears were streaming down her face, and I handed her a copy of my divorce petition. "Samantha Hayes, you have been served," I declared, as I turned to leave. Rachel tried to follow, but Ethan gave her a menacing look, forcing her to sink back, sobbing, as her friends tried to console her. Lisa had the last word. She stormed up to IAC. The music stopped, the dancers merged into the throng, and the observers stood in uncomfortable stillness, the only sound coming from the three embarrassed girls sobbing at the foot of the Abraham Lincoln Monument. Ethan took Lisa and me to a waiting cab, and we drove to Long Beach. I briefly considered returning to ask Rachel how she liked her surprise, but I decided it was unnecessary. Rachel tried to contact me several times, but I ignored her calls, emails, and texts. When her lawyer contacted mine, I made it clear that I would only speak with Rachel during our property settlement negotiations. After a lot of back and forth, we scheduled a meeting in Rachel's law firm's offices. My lawyer wasn't happy about the location, but by then, he wasn't pleased with me anyway, so I didn't care. We entered a conference room as large as Rachel's apartment, while my lawyer seemed uneasy, but I knew I had control, so it didn't bother me. What did surprise me was seeing Richard, Rachel's father, sitting beside her. I should have expected that, I thought. As when we were all seated, I looked around the table. Rachel's attorney looked at me like I was an odd specimen under a microscope, while Richard glared, clearly furious that I had hurt his daughter. Rachel avoided eye contact entirely. Her attorney spoke first. "Mr. Bradshaw, we've gathered here at your request to discuss a property settlement for the dissolution of this marriage. We have a proposal that I believe you'll find more than fair." My attorney attempted to speak, but I cut him off. "Forget it." Richard leaned in to speak to Rachel, but I overheard him clearly. "I told you to make him sign a prenup." Her attorney, embarrassed, tried to refocus on the settlement, but I wasn't having it. "Drop it," I repeated. I turned to Richard. "Mr. Mitchell, I married your daughter for love, not for money. You may not understand that, but my father taught me that a man's honor matters far more than his wealth." I addressed Rachel's attorney again. "There are only two things I want in this settlement. Once you agree to them, you'll have no further demands. The first thing I want—" Rachel hit her head on the table and began to weep. "The second thing I want is 30 minutes alone with Rachel, during which she promises to answer my questions truthfully. Give me those two things and I'll make no further claims." My attorney shook his head in astonishment, knowing Richard's net worth and knowing he wouldn't receive a piece of it, but Richard instantly brightened up. "Will you put that in writing?" he said excitedly. I glanced at him coldly. "In my family, a man's word is his bond. But for your peace of mind, yes, you'll sign an agreement." Richard didn't detect my sarcasm because he was too busy asking his attorney to create the contract. Then he went to Rachel and said, "Give him the rings. Let's get out of this mess." As she grudgingly removed the rings, I got up. "Since we're all in agreement, I'd like everyone except Rachel to leave the room. My 30 minutes will begin once you're gone." Richard hesitated, but ultimately rose and drew the family attorney toward the door. "Get that agreement written up immediately. I want his signature on it before he leaves." After everyone else had departed, Rachel and I were left facing each other across the table. I sat for a bit, wondering where to begin. I'd been thinking about this moment since the day at Lincoln Square, but now that it was here, I struggled to start. Finally, I decided to just ask. "When did it start, Rachel?" She glanced up, realizing my query. "I guess it never really stopped," she said. "I guess it never really stopped," she told us. Eye contact kept sending me profiles of all those attractive guys, and I wanted to sample them all. "I thought you loved me," I confessed. "I did, Nathan. I really did," she answered with a sigh. "But when you were away, I'd get bored and want to party. It didn't seem wrong to try out alternatives, especially since I was sure you'd never find out." "Then why did you agree to marry me?" I requested an explanation. "Oh, Nathan, your proposal at the Space Needle was so perfect," she continued, her voice shaking. "No man had ever cared about me like that. It was so exciting, and I decided to go for it. I knew my parents would be upset, but that made it even more thrilling." I stopped to analyze her remarks. "So how long after our honeymoon did you start using eye contact again?" "I promised myself I'd stay faithful," she said, turning her head upward. "But when you went back to the West Coast, I got bored. Then I got a new batch of profiles from my contact and I missed the thrill of meeting new men. But I didn't act on it at first because I didn't want to hurt you. Then I had to go to Chicago for work, continued her companion. And I realized Chicago was a different world. I updated my iContact profile to that city, and when I went there, her tone decreased. I remembered my first trip to the West Coast following our honeymoon, thrilled to return to her. I couldn't remember when her first trip to Chicago was, but it couldn't have been more than a week or two later. Less than a month after our wedding, she was already cheating. So every time you went to Chicago? I let the question dangle. She nodded, guilty. I shifted my focus. Did Sophia and Olivia know? Oh yes, she responded, her voice laced with guilt. We've been together for so long that we don't keep secrets, and they didn't care. I gazed at her, feeling the weight of her words. No, they benefited too, she continued, then stopped suddenly. I had already realized what she meant. You passed your men to them, I said, a cold understanding coming on me. After you were done, you gave them to Sophia and Olivia. She flushed and turned aside. Well, there wasn't anything wrong with them. The 3 roommates, I said quietly. More like 3 little cheats. Rachel's silence reinforced my assumptions. It's understandable that they didn't want to end their living arrangement. One last question, I interrupted. Why? Why couldn't you stop and just love me? She looked down. Her voice was soft. I don't really know. When I got to Duke University, I was voted the hottest freshman. At first, I loved the attention and the intimacy. Then I dated an upperclassman, but it got boring, so I dumped him. I realized I liked the excitement of a new man. The thrill of the first time. She waved a finger. After that, I was with a different guy almost every week, and I loved it. Sophia and Olivia loved it too. After college, I started my job in investment banking, she said, but the hours were long, and most of the guys were married. I tried singles bars, but they were hit or miss. Then I found iContact, and their members were top tier. It was like my personal buffet, new profiles every week. As she talked, I understood she was as reliant on this lifestyle as if she were addicted to medications. I got up, the 30 minutes weren't nearly gone, but I'd had enough. Seeing me stand, Rachel rose too. Nathan, I know I hurt you, but I do love you. We could be happy if you could get past my need for excitement. It could work. You could even be with Sophia and Olivia if you wanted. I felt queasy, but before I could answer, Richard and Rachel's attorneys returned with mine, handing me a paper that said, I believe this agreement satisfies your requests, and your attorney has approved it. I picked up my grandmother's rings, pocketed them, and signed the paper. As I arose, William Hayes gazed at me with wonder in his eyes. I may have misjudged you, young man, he said, reaching out his hand. Perhaps, I said bitterly, but I certainly misjudged your daughter. I disregarded his hand and left the room. When my divorce was finalized, they even threw a big party at the club where Ethan worked. I was probably the only straight person there, but I had a great time. The Oracle colleague who had been living with Ethan and Lisa got transferred, so I was able to move back in with them. They were incredibly supportive, always attentive to my emotions, and whenever I was feeling down, which was often, they tried to cheer me up. Despite their efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being a failure. I had lost at the dating game, failed at love and marriage, and even moving back in with Ethan and Lisa felt like a step backward. It wasn't their fault, but it felt like I was right back where I had started. I saw Rachel once when I was downtown for a late meeting and stopped by a lively restaurant to grab something to eat. She was there, laughing and flirting with a younger guy. My appetite vanished and I left without ever seeing her. I hadn't expected her to change, but seeing her act the same only deepened my sadness. A few weeks later, I got a call from a headhunter. If you work at a place like Oracle, those calls are common. This one was for a position leading network security for a major hospital chain. They were digitizing medical records and needed to address the security risks. What caught my attention, however, was that the job was the hardest part of the move was leaving Ethan and Lisa, who had seemed so eccentric when I first met them, but now they were dear friends. I accepted the offer because Los Angeles had lost its allure and it was time to move on. As I looked at my belongings on the floor of the apartment, I realized how little I actually owned. When I reached out to shake Ethan's hand, he drew me into a bear embrace, reminding me of his strength. "Don't forget us, Nathan," he urged firmly. "We won't forget you." I had planned to make a light comment, but I couldn't. "I won't forget you, man. I promise," I said. Then I turned to Lisa and saw tears in her eyes. I couldn't speak for fear of crying myself, so I leaned in to kiss her on the cheek. To my surprise, she turned her head, and I ended up kissing her on the lips. She hugged me tightly and quickly ran into a room. There was nothing left for me to do except collect my belongings and hail a taxi. Nashville felt both familiar and strange at the same time. I missed the constant buzz and excitement of Los Angeles, but I appreciated the warmth and hospitality of the people here. Just as important, I loved all the greenery. In Los Angeles, everything was concrete, with only the occasional tree struggling out of the sidewalk. In Nashville, grass and trees were everywhere, and I realized how much I'd missed it. I ended up buying a century-old home in East Nashville. After settling in, I began running again, something I hadn't done much of in Los Angeles, and joined a running club, which not only helped me stay active but also gave me the opportunity to meet new people with similar interests. Many of them were women, and I gradually began dating again. That's how I ended up passing a small gay nightclub that Saturday night with my date, and we saw a female impersonator performing on stage. She turned to me, puzzled, and asked, "I don't get it." I couldn't help but think of Ethan and Lisa, remembering how unconventional they had seemed when I first met them. Then memories of Rachel came flooding back, and it hit me that she was the real mystery. I still didn't understand her, and I doubted I ever would. I remembered that night on Hollywood Boulevard and thought maybe Lady Gaga's words were the best explanation. I turned to my date and shrugged. Maybe they were born that way. As I sit on the porch of my century-old home, watching the sunset over the familiar Nashville skyline, I can't help but reflect on the twists and turns that brought me here. It feels like a lifetime ago that I stood in Hollywood Boulevard, orchestrating a flash mob to impress a woman I thought I loved. In those moments, it seemed as if life was a series of elaborate surprises, each one bigger and more dazzling than the last. But life, as I've learned, isn't about the Los Angeles had a way of drawing me in, making me believe that the next big thing was always just around the corner, but after everything I've come to realize, it's not the city that defines you, but the people who stand by you when the glamour fades. For me, those people were Ethan and Lisa, my unlikely but true family, who saw me at my lowest and reminded me that vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's a strength. Moving back to Nashville was never part of my plan. In fact, for a long time, I resisted the idea, thinking that returning would feel like a retreat, like admitting that I couldn't make it in the big city. But what I've learned in the years since is that strength isn't about staying where you're supposed to be, it's about choosing where you want to be, and more importantly, who you want to become. Rachel was a chapter in my life, a whirlwind of passion, deception, and confusion. At one point, I thought she was my future, the person with whom I would build a life. But in the end, she was a mirror, reflecting back all the things I needed to confront about myself. Through her betrayal, I learned what I value most: honesty, loyalty, and the courage to be yourself, even when it's difficult. I've chosen to see Rachel not as the woman who broke my heart, but as the catalyst that pushed me to truly understand what I need in a relationship. She showed me the importance of integrity and reminded me that love, real love, doesn't require constant surprises. It's built in the everyday, in the shared moments of laughter, in the quiet support during hard times, and since my return to Nashville, I've rebuilt my life. I've found success in my career, leading a major hospital's network security team, a job that challenges and fulfills me in ways I never expected. I've made new friends, rekindled old connections, and even started dating again. But this time, I'm not looking for fireworks or drama, I'm looking for someone who sees me as I am, not as some grand gesture waiting to happen. When my date inquired, "Why do they do that?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Because it's who they are," I said, realizing in that moment how much I'd grown. One night, while out with a date, we passed a small gay club. Through the open door, I caught a glimpse of a performer in drag, strikingly similar to the shows I used to watch with Ethan. Nashville has given me the space to breathe, reflect, and start over, and for the first time in a long time, I'm content with the steady rhythm of life, the simple, beautiful moments that make it all worthwhile. The past has a funny way of lingering, but it no longer defines me. It's just a story I lived through, a series of experiences that shaped me into who I am today. As the night settles in and the crickets begin there, and although I may never completely understand why some things occurred the way they did, I do know this: I'm stronger now, more at peace with myself, and more open to whatever the future holds. This is my story, not of the one who ran away, but of the one who found his way back. Thank you for watching. What is the most important lesson you believe we can learn from starting again after betrayal? Comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.